It's a historical reality of war that they're often faster and easier to start than they are to finish. Just the last 7 days provide a bit of a case in point, with 2 new conflicts ramping up in the Middle East and Afghanistan, while another, the war in Ukraine, crossed a new and grim milestone. 4 years. As we head into March 2026, what was originally billed on Russian state TV as a short, sharp special military operation has now entered its 5th year. Longer, as we previously said, than the Soviet Great Patriotic War, and should the fighting continue past the middle of this year, also on track to outstrip the First World War in its total duration. At a strategic level, the grinding nature of the war has often made it prudent to focus on issues like economics, social endurance, attrition, and geopolitical support. And we went over a number of those factors back in January. But today, I want to turn the focus back on the battlefield and the 2 forces that continue to contest it. Because while it might be tempting to look at very slow-moving lines on maps and conclude that the war in Ukraine is mostly a static affair, I'd suggest that the nature of the war and forces fighting it have changed dramatically since 2022, and even over the last year. And so today, I want to take a big picture view of some of the fighting in 2025, asking not just how the lines have moved or how tactics and technology have changed, and what observing countries probably should learn from the conflict yesterday, but also, as the war crosses another milestone, try to look both backwards and forwards. That'll mean starting with a look at the battle lines and the way they moved over the course of 2025, before turning to an arguably even more important factor, how the Ukrainian and Russian militaries broadly changed over the course of 2025, what the nature of the fighting in Ukraine currently looks like, and what warnings or lessons that might have for other countries. Then we'll try to zoom out to look at the military situation from a more strategic level. How close are both sides to achieving their stated military objectives, and what that means for what actions we should expect these forces to take in the campaign season of 2026. Before we do that though, a word from a sponsor. So let me welcome back long-term sponsors of the channel, Private Internet Access. I think one of the stranger realities of the modern internet is that while new technologies make it easier than ever to connect from basically anywhere, the reality of internet fragmentation might mean that where you connect from matters as much as ever. And so if you're trying to exercise a greater degree of control or look out for your privacy in a modern digital environment, your toolkit, your online survivability onion if you like, is probably going to stack multiple elements together the same way a military vehicle might. You might want to look out for the physical security of your devices. Make sure your passwords are secure, complex, and change regularly, supported by a healthy degree of suspicion. Every time someone says they have the opportunity to make you rich overnight, they just need your personal details and a small deposit first. Then beyond that, you might want a VPN, which with a click can enable you to reroute your internet traffic and change your publicly perceived IP address. In PIA's case, drawing on a list of servers covering 90 countries around the world and all 50 US states. It advertises availability cross-platform, compatibility with a range of streaming services, and unlike with some streaming services, here a single subscription enables you to cover an unlimited number of devices, while also benefiting from PIA's stated no logs policy. And so for those of you interested, there'll be a link in the description which will give you access to an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 bonus months, with the benefit of a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so with my thanks to PIA as always, let's get back to it. Okay, let's start with the battle lines themselves and how much territory we saw change hands over the course of 2025. In the past, I have warned about putting too much focus on how many tree lines the front line moves in a given number of months, but while I wouldn't suggest it's fit to be the only indicator we use, I think it can be a useful one, with the key point being what clues it might give us as a bit of a lagging indicator about the state of the Russian and Ukrainian armies, and what kind of leverage they might have through any negotiations process. Through 2025, Russia engaged in rolling offensive activity at multiple points along the front line. They generally held on to the initiative, and through 12 months of costly offensive action, managed to turn the territory occupation map in Ukraine from this to this. Obviously, different maps are going to have different conventions on what they define as occupied versus a grey zone versus Ukrainian held, but for the most part, every territorial control map you see, even the ones that Gerasimov might show Putin on TV, are going to tell you roughly the same story. That Russia generally advanced faster in 2025 than 2024, but still at an absolutely glacial rate by historical standards, or indeed by the 2022 standards of this war. The CSIS actually assessed the rate of average Russian advance around Pokrovsk as slower than the British and French forces on the Somme in World War I, and at Chasiv Yar more than 4 times slower than that, at around 15 metres per day. Now obviously when you have the large grey zones associated with the war in Ukraine involved in the process, assessing those kind of numbers with any precision is always going to be a fraught and somewhat subjective affair. But I think the map on screen gives you a decent flavour of where Russian gains over the course of 2025 were concentrated. The fronts in the Kherson region or up in Ukraine's northeast saw relatively little overall movement, with most Russian territorial gains taking place in the east, Not so much into the heavy defences around the urban agglomerations of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, for example, but into somewhat softer parts of the Ukrainian front in the area, biting not just into that eastern flank of Zaporizhia, but also into the Dnipropetrovsk region, one of the few frontline oblasts that Russia doesn't claim as Russian as a result of a very legitimate referendum. As you can see from this chart, the rate of those gains over the course of 2025 was occasionally lumpy. Months significantly below the roughly 400 square kilometre month average, like March and April or September and October, were generally followed by periods of higher gains, with November actually setting the record for the year at about 629 square kilometres. That would suggest those slower months might be correlated not just with stiffer Ukrainian resistance or less successful Russian operations, but also preparations for coming ones. I do think the chart illustrates at least two other points though. Firstly, that Russia never stops attacking entirely, and that while we might talk about Russian offensives or Russian breakthroughs, the gap between the low and high points here is never really that extreme. It's also very clear that the change month from month or year from year isn't necessarily linear. Depending on how you count, for example, recent Ukrainian counterattacks through February, a bit more on those later, appear to have either reduced Russian net gains for the month to relatively close to zero, or potentially even turned them slightly negative, suggesting in this war even incremental Russian gains aren't necessarily guaranteed. Especially when we've seen evidence the Ukrainians are still able to take opportunities to counterattack, potentially clearing out parts of the grey zone, reclaiming defensive positions, and force the Russians to decide if they want to pay the price in time, lives, and equipment to take those positions all over again. To give you a sense of the total scale here, by one estimate that I'll link in the description, Russia took about 3,600 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory in 2024 and another 4,800 in 2025. Compare that to the roughly 604,000 square kilometres of Ukrainian territory in total, and over the course of 2025, Russia occupied very roughly 0.8% of Ukraine. That figure for Russia's 2025 territorial gains is fairly close to the estimates for remaining Ukrainian-held territory in the Donbass as at time of recording. But I'd be very cautious about extrapolating that rate forward and use it to generate a timeline for Russia potentially pushing Ukraine out of Donetsk. For one, the rate of Russian advance in early 2026 is well behind what it was in 2025, and the Ukrainian defences there are extensive. There is all the difference in the world between taking relatively open fields and heavily defended strongpoints, and a lot of the areas Russia is demanding to just be given as part of any peace deal are long on those kind of defensive barriers. I think it's fair to say, for example, that, as expected, Pokrovsk is now finally under full Russian occupation. Depending on how you define the start and end of the battle, overcoming Pokrovsk took Russia very roughly 18 months. And in terms of both size and the scale of the defensive preparations, there's all the difference in the world between Pokrovsk and the larger urban agglomerations of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk that help anchor Ukrainian defences in Donetsk. A summary of the territorial changes in 2025, then, might give both sides reason for concern. For the Ukrainians, there clearly isn't an answer, at least yet, to stabilise the front line fully and stop the Russians grinding their way forward. On the flip side, in the long-running hypothetical race between the Russian army and a snail on its way to Kyiv, the snail isn't just winning, it's had enough time to claim asylum and apply for Ukrainian citizenship. As for more distant stated Russian objectives, like retaking Kherson, taking Zaporizhia, or even getting as far as Odessa, have we seen some Russian pundits openly call for, based on the dynamics we saw in 2025 and the first part of 2026, unless the god of war starts a Make-A-Wish Foundation and the Russians call first dibs, that's probably out of the question for now. Which gets us to some of the big picture ways in which these forces are changing, both since 2022 and especially over the course of the last year. Some of the major changes we saw in the Ukrainian force in 2025 were more to do with organisation than they were equipment. There was a push towards a core focus structure, rapid expansion of the unmanned systems forces, air defence organisation change with the introduction of interceptor drones, while at the top of the organisational structure, the Ukrainian cabinet went through a major reshuffle. The country got a new defence minister, and after the fall of Andriy Yermak, Budanov, the former head of Ukrainian military intelligence, became the head of the president's office. I think it's really important not to gloss over a lot of that stuff. Better coordination, better organisation, reduced corruption. These are all elements that can potentially boost the effectiveness of a force without you necessarily having more resources to pump into it. But on that equipment side, I think the data suggests we've seen something interesting. Basically, an extension, if you like, on a phenomenon we predicted way back in 2022. At that point, I suggested that in order to meet its resource requirements, realistically, Ukraine was going to have to go through a couple of steps. Firstly, it would have to rely on its own stockpiles, which were absolutely decisive in the first stages of the war. Then, it would need its various allies and supporters to go through their old stockpiles of Warsaw Pact-era material, Soviet pattern stuff that Ukraine could already sustain and knew how to use, and then arranged for it all to fall off the back of the truck on the correct side of the Ukrainian border, which, to a significant extent, especially if you're talking about countries like Poland, is pretty much what happened. But pretty quickly, I suggested, Ukraine's allies would have to transition over to providing NATO standard equipment, because the old Warsaw Pact stockpiles weren't infinite, and this was the kind of stuff that NATO could produce spare parts and ammo for. Not to mention that in a lot of cases there was a bit of a qualitative edge there, which a smaller force like the Ukrainian one might appreciate. In multiple equipment categories, that happened. And many of the training and logistics barriers that were repeatedly brought up as reasons not to give Ukraine this kind of equipment were generally overcome or at least mitigated. Not always cleanly or with sky-high serviceability rates, but well enough that everything from Ukrainian F-16s to Patriots are now a reality. The interesting twist on that wasn't really on the radar back in 2022 was that despite Russia's ongoing strategic bombing campaign, Ukraine would actually do a fairly good job of taking those new NATO calibers or NATO design features and then coming up with its own NATO-style systems essentially and cranking those out. Ukraine's 2S-22 is a classic case in point there. In 2022, this wheeled 155mm self-propelled gun was mostly a military curiosity. As of 2026, there's probably no other 155mm NATO SPG out there being produced at a faster rate. It also uses a longer 52 caliber 155mm gun, meaning congratulations, the Ukrainians managed to start mass producing a 52 caliber howitzer before the United States did, despite only adopting 155mm as a caliber relatively recently and being bombed by the Russians the entire time. When it comes to localized equipment, the Ukrainians have made plenty of production claims, and I'll go over some of those more in the future. But I do think the available loss data is broadly consistent, with Ukrainian domestic production playing an increasingly important role. This chart shows the visually confirmed losses of Ukrainian self-propelled guns, chopped into three categories, namely Soviet, Ukrainian, and NATO designs. What it seems to show is that at the start, Soviet stuff is what Ukraine had, so Soviet stuff is what Ukraine lost. As Western material started to arrive though, it quickly became critical with force and started to show up in the loss figures. In 2023, NATO systems made up about half the losses at the start of the year, whereas more recently, the numbers have been roughly 50-50. 50% Soviet designs, with the 122mm systems in particular often getting hit quite hard, and the remaining 50% roughly evenly divided between Ukrainian and NATO designs, as NATO artillery deliveries have slowed down and Ukrainian production has kicked up. The extent to which the importance of that Ukrainian production shines through really does vary between equipment categories, with there being some extreme examples in either direction. The overwhelming majority of Ukraine's small drones, for example, are Ukrainian in design and manufacture, while if you're talking about full-size SAM systems, those are overwhelmingly from NATO. You even see it shine through a bit when it comes to the Ukrainian tank force. From a Ukrainian perspective, it's been a long time since we heard tanks described as a priority for foreign assistance, but you can see the impact of waves of past aid between 2023 and 2026. In this case, you can think of the T-64 as Ukraine's tank, if you like. And so in broad strokes, what we saw is the T-72 and T-80 come to dominate Ukrainian losses in 2024, partly helped by massive shipments of those systems from the likes of the Poles, the Czechs, and the Russians. Then you start to see the likes of Leopards and a few Abrams show up in the lost data, although never much more than the 10% range. And then also the proportion of T-64s in the data begin to climb back above the 50% line, because shipments of T-72s or donations from the Russian military slow down greatly, while the Ukrainians retained an ability to repair or reactivate T-64s. The big picture here is that from a supply perspective, the Ukrainian military has changed in two key ways. It's now much more reliant on NATO and also its own domestically produced systems than it was earlier in the war, and also connected to the above, it's a much more drone-reliant force than it was in the past. It also places a lot more emphasis now than it did at the start of the war on wheeled protected mobility options, think MRAPs or IMVs. These are the visually confirmed Ukrainian equipment losses in selected categories for the 12 months leading up to the 1st of March 2023 and the 1st of March 2026. What you can see is a significant drop-off in main battle tank, IFE, and AFE losses, a lot of that is MTLB, as well as a major drop-off in Ukrainian SAM losses in parallel to the force transitioning over to more NATO standard equipment. But at the same time, you get this significant jump in the number of MRAPs and IMVs being lost. More than 400 MRAP being lost in the year up to March 1st, 2026, whereas IMV losses, destroyed, damaged, abandoned and captured, reached about 800 for that same 12-month period. That's mostly Humvees and Ukrainian Cossacks. The reasoning here is probably twofold. A lot of these vehicles do provide a significant degree of protection against threats like mines and drones, while also enabling Ukrainian forces to move quickly, with the other side of it probably just being the question of availability. At this point, Ukraine's foreign supporters have pledged nearly 10,000 MRAPs and IMVs in total, And just one recent Canadian announcement, this one, added an additional 383 Senator MRAPs from Canada, as well as another 66 Lab 6s. Essentially, this is one area of the equipment supply picture where the Ukrainian position arguably looks a lot better than the Russian one, which probably helps explain why we see fewer adapted civilian vehicles being used for assaults on the Ukrainian side, and instead, in the recent counterattacks, more stuff like this, with the survivability emphasis here being more on the ability of the vehicle to keep its passengers alive, even if the vehicle itself is knocked out by a drone, for example, as opposed to something like the Russian assault ladder approach, where instead you'll often see the Russians remove the doors or chop off the roof, and emphasize the ability of passengers to bail out rapidly if a drone is approaching. In a slightly different way, it's also clear the Russian military has been going through more than a bit of an inventory adjustment over time. One of the relatively early observations on the channel was that you can effectively think about Russian military equipment going into 2022 as falling into one of three categories. The most common were Soviet or immediate post-Soviet designs that were no longer in active production but had usually received at least some upgrades. Then at either end of the spectrum, you had less common but more modern equipment that was still in active production, think the T-90M or the BMP-3, and then finally a bunch of older, sometimes much older Soviet systems, long out of production and sitting in storage. The expectation was that even with efforts to ramp up the scale of the Russian war economy, they wouldn't be able to crank out enough of the truly new stuff in order to keep up with the rate of losses we were seeing at the time. They'd pull the decent stuff from storage first where they could, and then after that point, the main inflows would either be from reactivating older and less suitable equipment, ad hocing or upgrading what they could, while the lucky units got the supply of new stuff. We expected over time, losses might fall if availability became more of an issue, as the Russians moved to conserve more of what they still had, while that useful middle category of equipment that was useful in storage but not in active production might be at risk of going extinct over time, leaving a bigger and bigger gap potentially between the blokes with the T-90Ms and the blokes expected to stick a log on the front of a hunker and yell bang. It's taken years and the data's been bumpy along the way, but over time we've seen signs of more or less exactly that happening. Generally declining Russian equipment losses, and a number of useful but older Russian platforms making their way onto the endangered species list. The driving force here was the sheer rate of equipment churn, and the chart here gives you a sense of how that evolved over time. Here I've stacked losses in selected categories for the 12 months to March 2023, 2024, 25 and 26, with two observations immediately standing out. One, by the standards of just about any force out there, the losses in some of these categories are enormous. At time of recording, north of 4,300 tanks, 8,700 in the armoured or infantry fighting vehicle category, and then a few casual extras, like nearly 550 multiple rocket launchers and 1,000 self-propelled guns. The second is that, generally speaking though, the rates of those losses have been falling. Although it's worth noting, there were a couple of exceptions to that trend, with the big ones here being Russian fixed-wing aircraft, who had a worse year in 2025 than they did in either 2023 or 2024, and also Russian surface-to-air missile systems, which likewise had a pretty hard month, out to March 1st, 2026. Some of the narratives I've seen around those trends suggest that Russia isn't losing a lot of its heavy equipment as fast as it once did, which is true, and also that the ratio between Russian personnel and equipment losses has shifted in favour of the personnel. There, I think there needs to be an asterisk, because the big complicating factor here is that most visually confirmed loss databases only really track military vehicles, which doesn't capture the much greater Russian use of things like motorcycles and adapted civilian cars. Something like this assault ladder, for example, pictured just after it hit a mine on video, simply wouldn't count as a loss in a database like Oryx or War Spotting. But we should probably expect those kind of alternative assets to remain very relevant to the Russian force, as stocks of some types of military equipment, even with the fall-off in losses, remaining under pressure and in some cases, approaching depletion. A useful example here would be the Russian T-80, and here I really need to credit the works of people like Jompy and Covert Cabal, who've sunk a lot of effort into tracking the movement of Russian armour from storage depots to repair facilities, and then over to Ukraine, where the visually confirmed loss lists take over. T-80 was originally designed as the high in the Soviet high-low MBT mix. It was meant to be the more expensive, Gucci, more capable platform, while T-72 was the cheaper mobilization tank. Before the invasion of Ukraine, the Russians had mostly stored theirs, but as the fighting played out, there were a couple of features of the T-80 that made it especially popular. Not just was it a decent tank in general by Soviet standards, it also had specific edges over the T-72 and T-90, like the ability to reverse at more than 4 kilometers an hour. The Russians withdrew these things from storage in enormous numbers, and then basically kept pulling more. In 2021, the team estimated there were north of 1,400 T-80Bs or BVs in Russian storage. They, along with the roughly 100 T-90s, were probably the best MBTs the Russians had just sitting there. By 2023, that number had been cut by more than 2/3, and I'm told the latest figure is closer to the 50 mark. Not 50%, 50 remaining vehicles. So, by global standards, the Russians pretty quickly pulled out enough relatively good MBTs to equip several international armies. Where, you might be asking, did they all go? The answer appears to have been Ukraine, with more than 1,200 going on 1,300 entries in the visually confirmed loss data. It's also worth noting the pace at which the Russians have been sacrificing these things doesn't appear to have slowed down in 2024 or 2025. The T-80 was less than 30% of Russian MBT losses in 2022, then north of 40% in 2023, and has held fairly constant at around that level. That suggests to me that unlike some other categories of equipment, the Russians probably aren't making much effort to conserve these things. And so barring any successful restart of production, this is an example of a vehicle that might be on the slow road to fading away. I bring this up not so much because tanks are the most critical Russian weapon on the battlefield in 2026. They're very much not. I do it to illustrate some of that qualitative gulf that's opening up within the Russian army over time. Essentially, equipment-wise, between the haves and the have-nots. Those that are fortunate enough to get a good supply of recently manufactured, relatively modern kit, and those where things are considerably less rosy, where the communication system might be held together or was held together by Starlink terminals and Telegram, and the equipment might be ancient or civilian in nature. What we haven't seen happen, though, that we might have anticipated back in 2022 or 2023, is the Russian military's combat power attriting as fast as its equipment stocks have. Not just because they've done a relatively decent job of reactivating or manufacturing equipment to try and fill as many of the gaps as possible, but also because entirely new systems have emerged that are immensely dangerous to Ukraine and don't appear in these kind of figures. The Russian military's tactical drone capabilities, for example, especially in a post-Rubicon world, are completely removed from where they were back in 2022 or 2023. And so arguably, just like the Ukrainians, the Russian military can get away with less reliance on heavy equipment because it's adopted many of the tactics and technologies that have become so synonymous with this war. There's talk, for example, of the Russian military aiming for an unmanned systems force about 200,000 strong, meaning at a time where some international militaries might still be wondering if they can add a drone platoon to every brigade, the Russians might be talking about a drone force larger than the United States Marine Corps, which gets us to some broad observations about how the Russian and Ukrainian militaries and the way they fight has changed over time, and what warnings and lessons that might sound for some observers. And while the evolution has been steady and continuous, I'd very broadly chop it up into three main phases. The first begins and ends in 2022. It opens with a relatively small, active-duty Russian invasion force storming into Ukraine and attempting things like air assault operations or deep armoured thrusts that push them to the gates of the Ukrainian capital. From a resource availability perspective, this is the point in the invasion where Russian force quality, so the training of its troops, is at its highest, but the availability of those troops is relatively low, just as equipment and ammunition availability was sky high. And the way it attempts to fight at this point, organised into battalion tactical groups and attempting these fast-moving operations against an opponent's centre of power, arguably feel a bit like they're trying to take a couple of pages out of the American playbook. They move fast, and especially in the opening days, it has a bit of a shock and awe feel to it, potentially helping explain some internet classics from the era, like this one, confidently declaring the Ukrainian military just disintegrated on contact, and the country doesn't have an air force, air defence, or fleet anymore. Once it becomes clear that that isn't true, Ukraine starts mobilising in earnest and actually gains superiority in manpower. You then see a series of major Ukrainian actions that exploit some very sparsely held Russian lines. This is the era of things like the Kharkiv offensive, where the Ukrainian forces admittedly look very different from the Russian ones, because at this point they're constrained more on equipment and ammunition than they are manpower, but the speed and character of the fighting doesn't look entirely dissimilar. In both cases, essentially, this is relatively fast-moving, mechanised warfare. You have gaps or opportunities being exploited by mechanised or motorised forces. And it was an era where we got to see tank columns moving openly on highways in a manner that would be considered pretty much unthinkable in 2026, which explains why some of the first things Ukraine was pushing for were things they could potentially issue and field tomorrow to help counterbalance the Russian superiority in armour and artillery. NLAWs and Javelins, for example, were originally pretty high up the shopping list. Military observers in NATO states during this phase of the war might have felt relatively comfortable throwing stones. That might have been justifiable because while I think it's fair to say that 2022 might have been a bit of a closer run thing than is sometimes acknowledged, it did appear like the Russians might at least be lifting some inspiration from the 91 or 2003 playbook and were trying to fight, if you like, in the NATO fashion without being able to pull it off like a NATO country. So, relatively quickly, the Russians stopped trying to fight that way. You had things like the partial mobilisation and the rise of the Wagner Group that helped solve that manpower deficit. Organisationally, the modern, agile BTG-based structure got a bit of a slap, and the Russian military started to revert both back to a more Soviet-style structure, with larger organisational units better suited for the demands of attritional-style fighting, and adopted a more attritional style of fighting. During this period, which saw the likes of the battle for Bakhmut and then the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive that ran headfirst into the Surovikin line, I'd argue you saw some pretty stark illustrations of the move from fast-moving mechanised war to trench war. Defences often took an almost World War I style feel, relatively well-manned trenches potentially screened by the likes of minefields and other obstacles, with the primary casualty driver of both sides being the artillery. Now, far more accurate, more responsive and deadlier than its World War I equivalent, not just because of the greater capability of modern artillery pieces, but also because now, a lot of this fire was being drone spotted and corrected. Neither of those elements was new to the war. Artillery had been the dominant casualty driver in 2022 as well, and fixed defences were a major feature of the fighting in the Donbass, for example, well before February 2022. What this stage of the fighting did do, though, was turn more public attention to these factors. This is a phase where Ukraine was putting less emphasis on requesting more things like javelins, and as much as possible on more and more artillery ammo. Seeing war fought like this caused a number of Allied planners to basically go back to the books, so to speak. Some of the focus wasn't so much on learning an entirely new style of warfare as relearning an old one. No one ever deleted Battle Drill 7 out of the manual. It's just now there was more of an imperative to make sure that troops and commanders understood how to fight in an environment like that, and to rebuild the industrial base and ammunition stocks, so that artillery units wouldn't be downgraded to using stone-throwing trebuchets and catapults a couple of weeks after the outbreak of a full-scale peer-on-peer conflict. One thing that's important not to miss, though, is that while that trench war phase, if you will, was defined by many of the features we still see, an attritional struggle, relatively slow-moving front lines, based on the available data, the style of the fighting that's actually giving us those fairly stable front lines has changed dramatically. I'd suggest that was probably driven by a couple of factors coming together. Russia's qualitative and quantitative advantage in several equipment categories would narrow, but it would prove to be more effective than the Ukrainians in continually getting more manpower into uniform. That shift was happening alongside an absolute revolution in terms of the availability and capability of drones. We went from a situation where papers were met with almost disbelief when they described the loss of tens of thousands of drones per month relatively early in the war, to one where production and expenditure figures in the millions per year for both Russia and Ukraine were just the new normal. What that meant was that far from some of the initial predictions that drones would be a flash-in-the-pan weapon that would eventually be countered and then fall away, the battlefield actually became more and more drone-saturated and dangerous over time. Concentrating and manoeuvring without detection became ever more difficult, and in terms of casualty generation, at least according to Ukrainian figures, it's now Ukrainian UAS, the drone force, generating the overwhelming majority of Russian casualties, not the Ukrainian artillery. And while the latter remains immensely important, it relies to a great extent on Ukrainian drones to spot and correct for it. The tactics of 2025 and early 2026 then look very different to the early stages of the trench war. Large combined arm breach attempts, like the Ukrainian effort in June 2023, and the many Russian efforts, places like Volodar come to mind, have mostly given way to more UAS-centric approaches. We'll go into more detail on how this works in the future, but the spark notes would be that preparation for offensive movements now heavily rely on the work of UAS as well as conventional fires. UAS might be used extensively not just to reconnoitre a defensive position or steadily try and break it down with constant attacks, but also to try and isolate it by interdicting supporting supply lines, attempting to cut troops at the zero line off from resupply of things like food and ammunition, while also greatly complicating reinforcement and rotation. Then when it comes to actually taking the positions that have been weakened by attacks on supply lines, as well as defending drone operators, electronic warfare, etc., as a very general rule, noting the level of confidence involved here, the precise tactics used do tend to vary between the two sides. Offensive tactics on the Russian side have come to significantly rely on continuous, small-scale infantry infiltration assaults. Small groups of a handful of Russian soldiers, either on foot or in a light vehicle like a motorcycle or a converted civilian car, attempting to go forward, preferably under the cover of adverse weather conditions to provide a degree of protection from drones, and any who survive to make their way through relatively porous Ukrainian lines, eventually attempting to concentrate and nibble away at the Ukrainian territorial holds. As we've discussed in the past, that kind of tactic probably wouldn't work well against well-manned continuous trench lines of the kind you might have seen during the First World War, or even earlier stages of this war. But with the lethality of the modern battlefield and shortages of Ukrainian infantry, that's not what Ukrainian front lines look like anymore. It's now pockmarks of small fighting positions, troops that might be concealed in a basement or a well-concealed dugout, that are often going to be functioning more as a sensor than they are a defensive barrier, only engaging if they absolutely have to. That limits the vulnerability of the forward Ukrainian infantry and the number needed to hold any given area of frontline, but it does potentially create gaps that we've seen these Russian tactics nibble away at. To a great extent, the Ukrainian responses to this increasingly drone-dominated battlefield has been to lean ever more on drones, whether that be UGVs that can potentially hold frontline positions or take on logistics tasks, or ever more small UAS to provide that battlefield surveillance and strike function. We'll go into some of those core features of the contemporary battle space in a moment, but from the perspective of outside forces observing this conflict, I think there's a very important point to make up front. If the temptation from 2022 was to take the lessons that combined arms mobile warfare works, you just need to do it properly, and the lessons from 23-24 were that we need to be prepared for a world in which trench warfare might be a modern reality, if you're still getting ready for those same trenches in 2026, you may be in danger of missing the training boat a bit. Because I'd argue the war we're seeing now isn't so much World War I but with drones, it's now drones with a little dash of World War I. What do I mean? If we're trying to zoom in on those core features of the fighting in 2026, that other nations are going to have an imperative to acknowledge, learn from, and adapt to. A key element to point to up front is the near omnipresence, at least for the moment, of adversary ISR assets in the form of drones, out to the limits of the tactical and even into the operational depths. This change has been driven not just by the greater availability of drones, but also the improvement in their capabilities. In the early stages of the war, for example, you might expect a basic quad-rotor, your DJI Mavic type system, to be carrying out reconnaissance operations ranging out in the single-digit kilometre bracket from its launch point. Beyond that, you might have somewhat larger fixed-wing systems, think the Russian Orlan series, that could potentially range out a couple of 100 kilometres while still being cheap enough that you wouldn't want to shoot it down with a surface-to-air missile if you could avoid it. Then, potentially to go beyond something like that, you might have a medium-altitude, long-endurance drone, think something like the Bayraktar TB2, that could potentially go much further, had a better sensor package and a lot more endurance, but at the same time was expensive enough to merit getting a Buk or S300 to the face. That's part of what makes it so significant, for example, that we're already getting video out of Iran, appearing to show large American drones that should be good targets for air defense systems, apparently openly flying in daylight in Iran proper, and being able to fire relatively short-range missiles against valuable targets like TELs. Half a world away in Ukraine, you wouldn't expect to see that. The war in Ukraine has generally made life very hard for those larger and more expensive systems. The problem is, those small UAS are not a solved problem. And if you compare them to where they were in 2022, 23, or even 2024 and early 2025, the difference is absolute nightmare fuel. Courtesy of things like mothership and repeater drones or fibre optic control, as well as very cheap fixed-wing systems like the Russian Molniya, we've now seen even the relatively small stuff used for precision strike over longer distances. If you want an example that tells the story, this recent Russian drone hit on a Ukrainian HIMARS is arguably a decent illustration, mostly because the reported geolocation here is something like 50 kilometres from the SS front line. There was a time where that kind of distance in Ukraine might have provided good protection against drone threats. In 2026, significantly less so, with the threat very much going both ways, as we see, for example, with Ukrainian loitering munition attacks on Russian air defense systems in places like Crimea. And I think it's fairly telling that according to one report, since the invention of the fibre optic guided drone in Ukraine, Russia has gone from consuming less than 1% of the global fibre optic cable supply to more than 10% in 2025. Combine that with Ukrainian demand, and a significant chunk of global fibre optic supply may now actually be going to creating the eerie fibre optic spiderwebs that now crisscross much of the Ukrainian battlefield. And just as I said back in 2023, I still don't think there's any reason to think that the development and production race has actually reached anything near its zenith. And I say that even while acknowledging the data here is far from perfect. It's hypothetically possible, for example, that drone units on both sides might have an incentive to exaggerate their importance, that drone manufacturers have a reason to talk up their product, and when it comes to the base of available video evidence, that drones, especially FPVs, are always going to have an advantage because they, out of necessity, have to take video records of their engagements, which is something an artillery shell or especially a landmine might be less able to do. We also have to be aware there's a wide spectrum of publicity, if you like, between various Russian and Ukrainian units, with some sharing video frequently and others being much more secretive. But I do think a lot of the evidence points in the direction of a more drone-dominated battlefield, with longer small UAS engagement ranges and an expanding drone kill zone. Everything from video evidence to interviews with troops, estimated production figures, and even things like the outer protection both sides decide to put on their vehicles. If you take the famous so-called cope cages as an example, back in 2022, a standard Russian configuration might look somewhat like the ones on the right there. Meanwhile, Ukrainian vehicles might go into battle with nothing of the sort at all. Here, the angle of coverage, but also the amount of design sacrifice being made is extremely limited. It's only really going to come into play if you're dealing with something like a top attack munition, think a Javelin ATGM or potentially a drone drop grenade, and even then only from a certain arc and only over part of the turret. That suggests it might have been ATGMs as much or more than drones that were front of mind at the time, and while there's a little bit of sacrifice in terms of increasing the profile of the vehicle, making it easier to spot from a distance, the tank is still clearly capable of functioning as a tank. Cut to examples like this from more the 23-24 period, and you see attempts by both the Russians and Ukrainians to protect more of the vehicle, with an apparent focus more specifically on the drone threat. This kind of net or cage style protection, for example, isn't going to do much against a high-spec ATGM, but it might potentially be useful against the kind of smaller munition that might be carried by an FPV or potentially dropped by a small bomber drone. If you look at recent images of knocked out Ukrainian IMVs and MRAPs, a lot of them are going to feature all-around or near all-over-round cage protection. But even those fall short of something else we've seen emerge over time. The specific evolution into the Russian turtle tanks or assault sheds with their all-around box superstructures, or some of the more recent iterations, the hedgehog or porcupine tanks that you can see examples of on the right there. Everything about these hedgehog designs, like the one you can see on the bottom right there, indicates troops willing to sacrifice just about everything else in order to maximize protection against drones. The vehicle looks like a weaponized 2-story shaggy carpet. A one-eyed seagull with cataracts is going to be able to spot this thing as soon as it comes over the horizon. Crew visibility is going to be abysmal, as evidenced by the fact that we've seen some of these vehicles drive into obstacles like lakes and trenches. And one of the primary advantages and cost drivers of building a tank, the rotatable turret, just isn't going to work with a bunch of these designs. My core point is, you don't build something like this because drones are a problem, you build something like this because drones are the problem. In the past, we've talked about some of the generic approaches that forces might take to try and make themselves survivable on a highly lethal and transparent battlefield. You employ concealment so they can't find you, dig in effectively enough that the other side is going to struggle to kill you, or disperse to the point where they look at their available munitions and decide it's not worth killing you. None of those approaches are conducive with trying to concentrate forces together for a coordinated push, or attempting to move in force to exploit a breach, for example, to turn a tactical advance into an operational one. For that, a traditional source of survivability, besides just suppressing the adversary's capabilities, would be speed and refuge in audacity. You concentrate quickly, move faster, and then disperse or dig in again before your opponent can find their feet and fires can do their work. In Ukraine, that's generally been much, much harder in the latter part of 2025 and early 2026 than it was in 23 or 24. And for the most part now, survival means either being able to not be seen by drones in the first place, or being dug in so deep that you can survive if you are. That's had a range of implications, like any military activity that requires personnel or vehicles to expose themselves becoming incredibly dangerous. Resupply, medevac, and troop rotation, for example, have become incredibly dangerous activities. And with the effective range of many small UAS now more closely resembling rocket artillery than a mortar or ATGM, it bears emphasizing that especially if a bit of hardware is valuable, it's realistically no longer enough on the Ukrainian battlefield to move it 1 or 2 terrain features back from the front line. Distance can still provide a degree of refuge, but you're talking about dozens of kilometres, not a handful. And one reason we might actually expect the situation to get harder before it gets easier for troops and vehicles moving along those G-locks is that a number of Ukrainian sources in particular talk to commanders who only have so many drone assets available, often being reluctant to release any of those available assets from hitting targets like Russian infantry in danger of overrunning their positions, to instead focusing on interdicting supply lines or hitting targets further out. But if drone forces and drone capabilities continue to expand, it may eventually be that there's enough UAS assets to go around, in which case the deeper parts of the drone kill zone might become even more dangerous than they already are. In that kind of environment, traditional trench systems in the open are more or less out. They're too exposed, too easy to find, and while they might be artillery resistant, unless the troops are in deeper dugouts and have good overhead cover and concealment, they're far from drone resistant. Obstacles set up in the open, like dragon's teeth, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, or minefields, are still very useful, especially when it comes to channeling potential attacks. But manned fighting positions, infantry or vehicle, realistically need to be set up with concealment and overhead cover in mind. That might mean basements in urban areas or tree lines out in the open. This goes to part of the reason why I think it remains credible that Russian casualties have outstripped Ukrainian ones in general. From the earliest stages of the invasion, one of the arguments I've commonly seen online is that because Russia has the firepower advantage, all else being equal, you'd expect the opposing force, the Ukrainians, to be taking greater casualties over time. But the thing is, all else isn't equal, including, among other things, the fact that Russia is usually the side attacking. One of the best, most reliable ways to get killed in Ukraine is to expose yourself, and short of digging more than a few very, very long tunnels, no one has yet found a way for infantry to effectively attack without leaving their basements or dugouts. Russian infiltration tactics rely on continuously exposing small groups or individual Russian infantry, and then rolling the dice again and again, knowing that a couple of them are going to hit that nat 20 and make it through. We've seen different types of tools used at various scales, ranging from the effective to the ridiculous, in the effort to screen these infantry from, for example, thermal cameras. Something like this you'd imagine would be an extreme outlier example, where sure, you might get some camouflage effect against thermal sensors, albeit at the cost of some minor degradation to the infantry's mobility and situational awareness. It's worth noting that on occasions where we've seen the Ukrainians go on the attack, their casualties have tended to spike as well. And so I don't think it's fair to assume that a disparity in casualties necessarily means that the Russians are lagging in drone capability or numbers. Russian industry and volunteers have turned out drones for their operators in enormous numbers. It's just that there are far more likely drone catcher roles in the Russian military than there are for the Ukrainians. Another interesting point that foreign forces are probably going to be watching very closely is just how creative and experimental we've seen the Ukrainians get in trying to operate around a limited number of infantry on the front line. Part of this is probably driven by resource constraints. Ukraine just doesn't have the infantry to pack the front line with the density that a NATO manual might suggest, while on the other, it's also arguably a response to the nature of the kill zone itself. Every infantryman that you try and support forward is a supply demand. If I'm holding a given area front with a company worth of troops, I need to supply a company's worth of ammunition, a company's worth of food. I need to meet the medevac requirements for a company, and when the time comes, I need to rotate a company. And every part of that process means exposing someone or something to potential Russian drone attack. If you could do it with a platoon instead, you'd cut down that vulnerability. An example of this might be trying to use unmanned systems to hold frontage, whether that's a continuously present UAS force that's always monitoring a given area, or the use of things like UGVs. There have been reported cases, for example, of Ukrainian machine gun-armed UGVs holding positions for days or even weeks at a time. And an interesting innovation we're starting to see more of is a situation where you have a single individual controlling multiple units. You could have one operator, for example, supervise 2 or 3 UGVs. If you work on the assumption that in this environment, Russian infantry are unlikely to be assaulting multiple UGV positions at the same time, one operator can potentially watch multiple camera feeds and switch to controlling whichever one has Russian infantry or targets in sight. There are obviously drawbacks here compared to just having troops in the hole fighting off the attack, but if the emphasis is on minimizing the number of personnel at the contact line and shifting more of the logistics and combat burden to unmanned systems wherever possible, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more experimentation with stuff like this through 2026. The core point here is that I argue that as time has gone on, the war in Ukraine has moved further and further away from what NATO and other observer states know. To oversimplify, you could suggest that initially the Russians tried to fight the NATO way but couldn't execute on it. Then they tried to fight the Soviet way, but lacking the resources of the Soviet Union couldn't pull it off in the longer run, and that what we're seeing now is something new. Something which puts new technical and tactical pieces of the puzzle together in order to produce something that is incredibly dangerous relative to the resources required. For lack of a better term, we won't call it the NATO way or the Soviet way, it's the modern Ukrainian way. The trickle of reporting we've seen about the limited number of exercises where the Ukrainians have been able to openly act as the OPFOR against NATO forces in exercises confirms that point. Unless scenario assumptions or restrictions are put in place to restrict the ability of Ukrainians to use their drones or their battle management system, then in a lot of scenarios, they might punish an unprepared NATO force. Or at least reportedly, that's what the recent exercise Hedgehog 2025 seems to have indicated. As a side note, I have requested some additional information on that and a few other exercises, and once I have more concrete to say about them, we'll have a deeper look. The point is, the war in Ukraine has become an incredibly costly but fast-moving pressure cooker for military development. Through some very painful lessons teaching them what didn't work, Russia and Ukraine have steadily found things that do. And so if other nations want to be able to gain some of the benefit of those lessons without paying the same costs, they need to be watching, learning, and changing. So where does that potentially leave things at a big picture level as the fighting stretches into its 5th year? I think one broad observation to make up front is that when you're talking about the military side of the war in Ukraine, it can often feel like a huge amount is changing on a regular basis, only to produce a broadly similar result. The tactics, the tools, the command and control processes all look a lot different now than they did even a couple of years ago. And frankly, if you were somehow able to teleport the Ukrainian unmanned systems forces of 2026 or Russia's Rubicon unit back to March 2022, the sheer amount of havoc they'd probably be able to inflict on an unprepared opponent
might have been enough to produce a different outcome, but with the forces adapting and counter-adapting in lockstep, some of the old basic battlefield dynamics remain in place. This is, at its core, still a bloody attritional slugging match. One where a key question remains what will ultimately break or deplete first, and for which force. After 4 years of war, the Ukrainian military is by and large undermanned, older than when it started, and exhausted. Exhausted, as one colleague put it to me, in the kind of way that 100 good nights' rest isn't going to solve. But while there have been serious issues with things like troops going AWOL or trying to avoid mobilisation, by and large the Ukrainian defence has remained incredibly stubborn, and the lines on the map show that. If at any point in the last 4 years you'd bet against the willingness of the Ukrainian military to fight on, you would have lost. And recent Ukrainian counterattacks pretty clearly demonstrate that the force is still capable of serving up tactical surprises, especially at a local level. On the flip side, the Russian army has both retained its ability to attack despite the attrition demands placed on it, while also facing its own ticking time bombs and problems. Casualties, especially compared to the early stages of the war, are high. They've already lost one promising communication tool in the form of Starlink, and there may be a potential threat to another in the form of a Russian government ban or restrictions on Telegram. In some categories, the cupboard of old Soviet kit is starting to look a bit bare, and in order to stay functioning, the system relies on Russian recruiters to continually hit their targets and maintain that long-standing Russian advantage in replacement manpower. It's also clear that as long as the Russian military remains focused on Ukraine, its ability to respond to other geopolitical developments is more limited, as has been clearly demonstrated over the last couple of years, with a number of Russian allies and partners having a rather bad time of it, with Russia's responses mostly sitting on the thoughts and prayers end of the spectrum. But leaving aside those broader strategic questions though, how does the military balance between the two sides currently sit in Ukraine itself? In a sense, that's more of a data-driven question that we'll dig into more in a future episode. But I do think there are a few things we can say about where both sides currently stand in relation to their stated wartime goals. Objectives, I think, here matter for two reasons. One, because they provide us a mechanism, even if it's not a perfect one, to potentially assess whether a side is succeeding or failing, for a lack of a better term. And secondly, because it's interesting to track how both sides' stated objectives have changed over the course of the war. Some Russian stated objectives from early in the war, like Ukraine not being able to join NATO, clearly remain in place. But others, demilitarization comes to mind, appear to have fallen away over time. Remember, back in 2022, Moscow was demanding significant reductions in the Ukrainian force, caps and reductions on a whole range of weapon categories, with a particular focus on banning or restricting longer-range weapons that could potentially threaten Russia proper. As of early 2026, though, if that remains a Russian objective, it seems to be further away than ever. The Russians have done a lot of damage to the Ukrainian military, but overall, it's still a larger force than when it started, with a much deeper bench of modern equipment and some almost entirely new tricks. Among them, and completely antithetical to that stated Russian objective, is a massive growth in Ukrainian homegrown long-range capabilities, with just the last week seeing attacks by one-way attack drones, footage of the test of a homegrown Ukrainian TBM being released to the public, and 2026 more broadly demonstrating just how much Ukraine's ability to strike into the Russian heartland has changed since Russia's demilitarization effort began back in 2022. And if there is any one image out there that illustrates just how much things have changed in that respect since 2022, I'd put forward at least two nominations. One, an anti-drone technical taking a defensive position outside the Kremlin more than 3 years into the special military operation, and the second nomination, this one. This is a still from a video released out of Russia, where the camera is pointed towards part of the Votkinsk Iskander missile production facility, and that large ominous black shape coming in at a relatively shallow angle is a Flamingo cruise missile. From the early stages in 2022, where Ukraine might be able to convert an ultralight aircraft into a small bomb and send it into Russia, or stage relatively short-range attacks using things like Storm Shadow supplied by its allies, this was a case of Ukraine only a couple of years later going after a sensitive military target 1,400 kilometers or about 900 miles into Russia, doing it with a domestically manufactured ground-launched cruise missile, and presumably having a rather deleterious effect on anything that was happening inside. For the moment, these kind of harder-hitting strikes, as opposed to those using long-range, relatively light one-way attack drones, remain relatively rare. But the point here is more the trend that something like this represents. If one of the initial stated goals was to demilitarize Ukraine and reduce the amount of military threat the government in Kyiv might be able to pose to Moscow or its interests, then the war effort of the last several years has been a catastrophically self-defeating exercise. It's driven the Ukrainians to develop entire new families of homegrown long-range weapon system and to crank up the production volumes, while at the same time stretching and exhausting Russia's own air defense systems.
In a sense, you could argue the Russian invasion and the continued war catalysed a surge of funding internationally into the Ukrainian defence industry. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where Ukraine, having built up all of that industry and capability, will just shut it all down when the war is over. After all, there's an international market to sell to, and fears of Russia will likely persist no matter what the final agreement is. Essentially, even if the Ukrainian military itself is desperately exhausted after multiple years of fighting, the domestic industrial capabilities that have grown up to support it might still be in their growth phase. If we assume then the demilitarization objective is probably mostly dead, the one the Russians don't seem willing to have budged at the negotiating table is the question of territory, at least mostly. For much of the war, the Russian demand at the negotiating table was that Ukraine needed to withdraw from 4 regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, as well as recognising Russian ownership of Crimea. What reporting about recent negotiations suggests is the Russians have now modified that position to the Ukrainians still having to withdraw from the fortress cities of Donetsk and hand the Donbass over to Russia, but maintaining more or less the present lines elsewhere. One reason that still matters a lot from a strategic perspective is it suggests that of the two sides, Russia is the one coming to the table saying that in order to achieve its objectives, it needs to obtain territory it doesn't already have. That means either getting the rest of the Donbass at the negotiating table, or carrying on the fighting and hoping that eventually the Ukrainians or their allies will crack. Militarily then, that means the Russian military has a lot of imperative to keep attacking, to potentially take territory, shape international opinion, influence negotiations, and wear down and attrit Ukraine and its forces. And on a battlefield where defenders enjoy so many advantages, that arguably gives Russia the harder military task. On the other side, we've also seen the Ukrainians publicly change their objectives, from being very much survival-focused in the first days of the invasion, to suggesting the possibility of militarily reclaiming the country's 1991 borders. The current Ukrainian negotiating position is a ceasefire along the current contact line, coupled not with NATO membership, but security guarantees and a pathway to the European Union. What that means is that while taking back terrain might be valuable to Ukraine for a variety of reasons, there's more scope for them to remain on the defensive while still pursuing their stated goals. And we've publicly seen Ukrainian leaders, including Syrskyi himself, take more of this defensive focus. Quote, "Until the negotiations are concluded, my task is to ensure that regardless of what happens, our actions on the battlefield prevent the enemy from advancing deeper into our defences and allow us to liberate our territory where possible. This is precisely what will ensure fair negotiations leading to a just peace." End quote. Short of a breakthrough at the negotiating table then, additional Russian offensives in 2026 seem almost inevitable. Ukraine is unwilling to give up territory that includes some of its most formidable defences and still a significant civilian population, while Russia publicly maintains the determination to take it one way or another. That leaves us with an overall situation where Russia still has an advantage in relevant military resources, manpower, equipment and ammunition, but also the more demanding, offensively focused objectives, with all that entails for the demands the Russian leadership are likely to make on their military this year. In that respect then, a lot has changed about the war in Ukraine over the last year, but a lot has also stayed the same. The fighting remains incredibly costly and slow-moving. The negotiating positions of both sides have narrowed, but as long as Russia continues to demand that Ukraine give up some of its best defensive positions, the two parties also remain politically a long way apart. Military exhaustion remains one of the most critical open questions for both sides, and in future episodes, from casualties to ammunition production rates, we'll dig into that issue more deeply. Everything from manpower availability to the stress being placed on air defence systems and the constant demand for more interceptor missiles. But for today at least, I think it's enough to say that even as other wars break out around the world, despite tens of thousands of pieces of heavy equipment being lost and human casualties that long ago crossed into the 7-figure range, the fighting in Ukraine continues, with a final outcome that still very much remains a case of only time will tell. And okay, given the circumstances, brief channel update to close out. Suffice to say, 2026 remains an eventful one, but while I imagine a lot of you might want to see relatively quick coverage of the events in the Middle East, my view is that 1, this milestone in Ukraine is important and this episode needed to be made, and secondly, that if I want to get the coverage of Iran right, we probably need to wait a little more for the fog of war to clear and more information to come out. I'll be keeping an eye on developments there in the coming days, but I'll only put a video out when I feel there's enough reliable information to do so. Until then, thank you for your patience with the delay to this one. I hope you found this more zoomed out look useful, noting I do intend to augment it with some more data-focused episodes in the near future. Thank you, as always, to all of you for your ongoing engagement and support, and with any luck, I'll see you all again later this week.